Tenby Street North, Jewellery Quarter, Birmingham, 9:10 on a February night, 1963. Sub-Officer Walter Pemberton, Birmingham Fire and Ambulance Service, 14 years at Central Station on Albion Street, was reading the yard before he read the fire. The Dennis F12 had stopped short of the workshop frontage because the yard access was 11 feet wide, and 11 feet was not enough room to bring the appliance past the gate pillars. That meant hose from the street, not from the yard. It meant the crew going in on foot with what they could carry. And it meant that whatever was burning on the second floor of that workshop, the smoke was pale and fast, not the slow black smoke of a chemical bath, had to be fought from further away than Pemberton would have chosen, in a building he had not attended before, but had attended 40 of, in one form or another, since 1949. The Dennis F12, that stood in Central Station's appliance bay on Albion Street, was by 1963 the standard first-line pump escape for most British city brigades, 336 of them built by Dennis Brothers of Guildford between 1950 and 1959. Its Rolls-Royce 8-cylinder engine put out 195 brake horsepower and could take the appliance from a standing start to 60 miles an hour in 40 seconds, which mattered on Birmingham's narrow inner-city streets, where speed off the mark counted for more than top speed. It carried a 50-foot wheeled escape ladder that could be unshipped from its trunnion mounting and wheeled to a building by two men without the vehicle itself needing to be positioned against the frontage, a design decision that mattered enormously in a district where the frontage often could not be reached at all. Period Fire magazine specifications for comparable Dennis pump escapes of this generation document a pump output in the range of 500 gallons per minute, delivered from a midships or rear-mounted pump depending on the specific build. What the F12 could not do was solve the access problem itself. On Tenby Street North that night, the pump's 500 gallons a minute were only as useful as the length of hose Pemberton's crew could run into a yard the appliance could not enter. The watch system at Central Station meant that the same 6 men who mounted that appliance had worked the Jewellery Quarter's narrow yards for years, and knew, before the officer said a word, which of the workshop courts had frontage enough to bring an escape ladder through and which required the ladder carried in by hand from the street. That knowledge did not come with the appliance. It came from the men who had been running hose into these same courts since before some of them had children. Before we continue, if this kind of documentation is what you have been looking for, consider subscribing. Every video on this channel goes into one specific element of the British Fire Brigade between 1900 and 1980. The appliance, the building, the knowledge that the officer had built from previous attendances, and the community that depended on that knowledge, before smoke detectors and sprinklers changed what fire could do before the crew arrived. Not spectacle. The documented operational intelligence of a fire brigade that protected a Midlands manufacturing district built from workshop and back-to-back stock that burned in specific ways that specific people had learned to read. What did 14 years of attending Jewellery Quarter workshop fires give Sub-Officer Pemberton that the Dennis F12's pump rating and the training manual had not provided? And what happened to that knowledge when the back-to-back courts and the Victorian workshop stock were cleared in the 1960s and early 1970s? And if you served in the fire brigade in this era, or your family did, in Birmingham or elsewhere in the Midlands, put it in the comments. If you served with the Birmingham Fire and Ambulance Service, or your family worked a Jewellery Quarter workshop or a back-to-back court in Hockley or Ladywood, what do you remember about how fire and its risk were understood in that community? The next video follows the same 3-layer method into Glasgow's tenement and shipyard fire risk of the same decades. Back at the appliance, Birmingham's industrial fire risk did not look like Manchester's or Sheffield's. It was not concentrated in one large mill or one steelworks that a division could learn as a single building. It was dispersed across hundreds of small premises: metalworking shops, electroplating workshops with acid baths, jewellery workshops using gas torches in rooms the size of a parlour, automotive component makers with cutting oils soaked into timber floors, each one different, each one sharing a yard or a party wall with 2 or 3 others, and often sharing that same yard with a family's back-to-back house. What 40 attendances at premises like this had built in Pemberton was not knowledge of one building. It was a way of sorting a workshop fast, in the first 90 seconds, into one of three categories: metal, chemical, or electrical. The color of the smoke told him which. Pale and fast, as at Tenby Street North, usually meant timber and packing materials burning above a workroom, not yet the acid baths on the ground floor. Thick and low, moving along a roofline rather than rising from a window, usually meant something burning in a shared roof void that 3 or 4 premises had never been designed to have a fire break against. That last pattern was the one that had cost him the most to learn. In 1955, at a workshop 2 streets from Tenby Street North, Pemberton's crew had attacked what looked like a single premises fire, only to find, 20 minutes in, that it had already crossed a shared roof space into the workshop next door, and from there, into the back-to-back court behind both of them. Nobody had told him the roof spaces connected. The building had told him, and by the time he had read it correctly, the fire had already made the decision for him. He carried that afternoon into every attendance after it. On Tenby Street North in 1963, the first thing he did before ordering the branch into the yard was ask which properties backed onto the workshop's roof. Not because procedure required it, but because 1955 had. Once Pemberton had a workshop fire sorted into its category, the second decision was isolation. Deciding which adjacent properties needed a line of their own before the seat of the fire was even reached. On Tenby Street North, that meant a second branch taken not toward the smoke, but toward the back-to-back court behind the workshop, where 4 households shared the yard the crew now occupied. A salvage sheet crew, standard Birmingham Fire and Ambulance Service practice for premises adjoining a working fire, moved into the ground floor rooms of the 2 houses nearest the shared wall, not to fight fire, but to move furniture and cover what could not be moved, because water running off a workshop roof into a court where 4 families lived did as much damage, in the ledger Pemberton kept in his head, as the fire itself. The breathing apparatus set, carried on the F-12 by 1963, was standard issue for enclosed workshop atmospheres, but it was of limited use against an acid bath that had not yet ignited. The crew's real protection there was knowing, before they went in, which workshops in this yard used which chemicals, information that existed nowhere on paper. No manifest system covered premises this small. A 4-man workshop making jewelry findings was not required to register what it kept in the back room, and most did not think to. What existed instead was Pemberton's own working list, built attendance by attendance, of which yards in his ground held metal polishing, which held plating baths, and which held nothing more dangerous than solder and gas bottles. A list that lived in one man's memory and that the Birmingham Fire and Ambulance Service had no formal way of preserving when he moved on. Sub-Officer Walter Pemberton had not been taught how to read Tenby Street North. He had been taught how to read smoke, color, speed, density, and he had been taught the basic principle that shared roof spaces in Victorian workshop courts did not respect property boundaries. What the training school at Birmingham Fire and Ambulance Service headquarters had not given him, and could not have given him, was the specific working knowledge of his own ground. Which of the several hundred small premises across Hockley and the jewelry quarter held which trade, which yards had frontage enough for an escape ladder, and which did not, which back-to-back courts sat directly behind a workshop wall, and which had a fire break of open ground between them. That knowledge had been built one attendance at a time across 14 years. And the 1955 fire that had crossed an unmarked roof space had been the single most expensive lesson in it. Nobody had died at that fire. 2 families had lost the contents of a home they had not known was at risk until water and smoke were coming through their own roof. Pemberton had carried the memory of standing in that yard afterward, understanding that the knowledge he needed had existed nowhere, except in his own experience, into every attendance since. This was not courage. It was pattern recognition, built from repetition, and the repetition had cost real damage to real premises before it produced reliable judgment. The knowledge had arrived at no other price, and it lived in exactly one place, the memory of the men who had spent years attending the same yards, workshops and courts, for a district too dispersed and too informally documented for any single record to hold what Pemberton knew by 1963 without having to think about how he knew it. The jewelry quarter that Central Station protected represented, in the 1960s, Europe's largest concentration of businesses in the jewellery trade, producing a substantial share of all jewellery made in Britain. But that trade was carried on almost entirely in premises the size of a large room, run by 2, 3, or 4 people, who had often built the business over a working lifetime and who had no capital behind them beyond the stock in their own workshop. A fire on Tenby Street North was not, from the workshop owner's side of the cordon, a building fire. It was frequently the entire accumulated inventory of a small family trade, uninsured against the specific risk of a neighbour's fire because that neighbour's premises had never been assessed as a risk to begin with. Pemberton's crew, more than once, had found themselves working not only to save a structure, but to save, from a locked and burning workshop, the specific trays and tools that represented a family's working capital, a decision made in minutes, without instruction, because the crew understood what was actually at stake behind that door. The back-to-back residents evacuated into the street on Tenby Street North that February night in 1963 had nowhere obvious to go. The court behind the workshop held 4 households who knew each other, who had likely watched this same workshop operate for years without incident, and who now stood in the cold, watching water run off a roof that, until that evening, none of them had thought connected to the danger next door. Children from a nearby school were kept indoors the following morning, as the smell of scorched timber and metal polish hung over the street. The interdependence of a trade like the jewellery quarters, small workshops that had shared apprentices, tools and sometimes premises for generations, meant that a fire in one corner of the district was, in a way no larger single-employer city ever quite matched, a fire that touched everyone who worked within a few streets of it. For the families living in the back-to-back court behind Tenby Street North, the arrangement of their housing was itself the risk, and had been for over a century before that February night. Birmingham had held roughly 40,000 back-to-back houses in 1931. By the late 1950s, the city's slum clearance program was removing them at scale, but in 1963, the courts behind the jewellery quarters workshops were still substantially intact, built 1 brick thick, sharing rear walls, and, as Pemberton had learned in 1955, sometimes sharing roof timbers with the workshop next door. A family in one of those houses had no meaningful firebreak between their home and a neighbour's business premises. Only a wall built to the minimum standard the 1875 Public Health Act had still permitted for existing stock, and a roof that a workshop fire could travel across in a way none of the residents behind that wall had reason to think about on an ordinary evening. What the fire brigade meant to a family in that court, in a way that would have been true nowhere in a modern suburb, was the specific institution standing between their 4 rooms and a fire in a business they did not own, staffed by a trade they did not practice, governed by regulations that did not yet require it to report what it kept on its own premises. The residents who stood in the yard that night were not spectators to someone else's misfortune. They were, in the plainest sense, watching the margin of their own safety being managed in real time by 6 men and a pump they could not see into the workshop from where they stood. The Factories Act, 1961, extended inspection and fire safety requirements into small workshop premises that had previously fallen below any threshold that required registration, a change that, over the following decade, began to put on paper the kind of information that Pemberton had spent 14 years carrying in his memory: what a given workshop held, how many people worked in it, what its means of escape were. Birmingham Fire and Ambulance Service developed its own risk assessment protocols for small workshops in this period, an attempt at exactly the kind of formal record that a single officer's working list could never have replaced across an entire division once that officer retired or was posted elsewhere. At the same time, Birmingham's slum clearance program, already running at scale through the 1950s, accelerated through the 1960s, and the back-to-back courts behind the jewellery quarters workshops began, street by street, to come down. By the early 1970s, nearly all of the city's Victorian back-to-back stock had been cleared. What this changed, for a division like Pemberton's, was not simply that the buildings were safer, though the newer premises that replaced them generally were. It was that the specific configuration of risk his 14 years had trained him to read, the unmarked shared roof space, the workshop with no manifest sharing a wall with a family of 4, The narrow yard that decided whether an escape ladder could be brought in at all was, block by block, disappearing from the ground he covered. The Factories Act did not ask what Pemberton knew about which yards held plating baths. It asked workshop owners to declare it themselves, on a form, to an inspector who might visit once a year. That was, by any reasonable measure, a better system than the one it replaced. It was also a system that had no place for the specific thing 14 years of attendances had built in one man, and no mechanism for asking him what he knew before the courts he knew it about were demolished. Sub-Officer Walter Pemberton retired from the Birmingham Fire and Ambulance Service in the early 1970s, not long before the service itself was amalgamated into the new West Midlands Fire Service in 1974. By then, the back-to-back court behind Tenby Street North was gone, along with most of the courts he had spent 14 years learning yard by yard. The workshops that remained were increasingly inspected under the Factories Act, their premises declared on paper rather than carried in one man's memory. What the changed district gave the brigades that followed him, modern industrial premises with fire-resistant construction, formal risk records, and workshops no longer sharing an undeclared roof space with a family of 4 behind a one-brick wall. What it removed, the specific working knowledge of exactly which yard could take an escape ladder and which could not, which shared roof spaces had never been marked on any plan, and which small trades sat 2 doors from an unregistered acid bath. Knowledge that 14 years of attendances had built and that no training document had ever been asked to record. The new premises did not produce the fires that had built that knowledge. They did not need to. That was the point. If this channel is going to keep documenting what British firefighters knew about the buildings they entered and what that knowledge cost to acquire, subscribe. There are more appliances, more divisions, more workshop yards read from the running board of a Dennis F-12 on a February night, and more shared roof lessons learned the wrong way in 1955 that were never written down anywhere and that kept Tenby Street North standing in 1963. What did 14 years of attending jewellery quarter workshop fires give Sub-Officer Pemberton that the Dennis F-12's pump rating and the training manual had not provided? And what happened to that knowledge when the back-to-back courts and the Victorian workshop stock were cleared in the 1960s and early 1970s? And if you have an incident, a station, a watch, a district, put it in the comments. If you served with the Birmingham Fire and Ambulance Service, or your family worked a jewellery quarter workshop or a back-to-back court in Hockley or Ladywood, what do you remember about how fire and its risk were understood in that community? The next video follows the same 3-layer method into Glasgow's tenement and shipyard fire risk of the same decades. Sub-Officer Walter Pemberton retired from the Birmingham Fire and Ambulance Service, having attended small workshop and back-to-back fires across the Jewellery Quarter Division for 14 years. The last of the back-to-back courts behind Tenby Street North was cleared in the same decade he left. What the redevelopment gave the district: fire-resistant industrial premises, declared risk under the Factories Act 1961, workshops built without a family's home sharing their roof. What it removed: the unmarked shared roof spaces that had taught Pemberton how fire moved between premises never designed to keep it apart, and the specific yard-by-yard knowledge that 14 years had built and that no inspection form had ever been asked to hold. The new buildings did not produce the fires that had built that knowledge. They did not need to. That was the point. The knowledge went with Pemberton. The courts went when the demolition crews arrived. Nobody had asked either of them to leave anything behind.